Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right, everybody, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about becoming a more dynamic communicator on podcasts, both as a guest and as a host. And I'm going to quickly introduce each of our speakers today, the people who are going to be helping out with this conversation that we're going to be going through. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We got EA, Michelle, and Matthew. I'm just going to go in that order. I don't know why I picked that order, but for whatever reason, that's how it happened. EA, would love to hear a little bit about you and what you're doing real quick here, and then we'll move through the other people.
Happy to share with you. I'm the founder of Givers University, and we basically teach people how to discern in their relationships. Businesses open and closing faster than ever before, products coming and going faster than ever before. All we have left is our relationships. And we teach people how to discern who they should have closer to them and who they may want to begin respectfully distancing themselves from because of what they bring with as a direct result. And happy to share with you some of the enjoying things I've been able to learn about storytelling over the years.
Love it. So glad to have you here. Michelle, we'd love to hear from you. The beach girl in Texas, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, hi, I'm Michelle Prince, and I help people to tell their stories. Primarily, we work with leaders, entrepreneurs, founders, people that really want to leverage the power of their story. And we also have a podcast called The Power of Authority, spotlighting these leaders who are doing great things, getting results, but ultimately everything is based on making a difference and changing people's lives.
Love that. Short and sweet, precise. It's really good. And Matthew, maybe I say the best for last, maybe not. I'm not sure. Matthew, you'll be the one to make that decision. I think you're muted right now.
So I'm known as the rapid growth guy, and I hope we have saved the best to last, but I guess we'll find out. So I'm known for writing the Introvert's Edge series. My passion is really about helping introverts realize that they're not second-class citizens. Their path to success is just different to that of an extrovert. I predominantly work with introverted service providers, helping them realize that if they just focus on 3 things outside the scope of their functional skill, they really can create a rapid growth business that they love. My books have sold about 75,000 copies. They've been translated into about 15 languages, and predominantly podcast is actually the #1 platform that allows me to transition people into downloading the first chapter and then buying the book. So, I really love podcast as a platform for getting in front of new audiences.
That's great, man. Really well said, and congrats. That's a ton of books. Unbelievable the amount of impact it sounds like you're having, man. So looking forward to hearing from you again in a minute here. EA, I want to circle back to you real quick because you mentioned your Givers University, and you talk a lot about this giver's mindset versus a taker's mindset. Can you talk about what that means specifically? And then I'd love to also hear how that applies to being a guest on a podcast or even being a host. You're muted.
There we go. It actually all goes back to really what my mentor taught me years and years ago. And he said, you got to decide which one of those you want to be. And we don't judge people. When we say giver and taker, we're not identifying a person or labeling a person. We always say we love everybody. And what we're doing is we're identifying the deeds, because we teach people to separate the person who we love from their deeds, which we may not love. And we actually had a very granular approach, very granular, actually have checklists of deeds. Watch for people doing these things. And when they do, you may want to pull them in closer into your life, because givers bring with them the 3 W's, wisdom, wealth, and wellness. Or as a direct result, when you see certain deeds, these are the actual things to look for, you may want to begin respectfully distancing yourself, not rude or nasty, but respectfully, because takers always bring with them the 3 D's of takers, which is defeatism, disruption, and destruction. And when you pull them in your life, you're going to be stomping out fires not of your own making. So we teach people that when you're a giver, you can expect people to take advantage of you. That's what happens. That's where it goes. But here's the second part that no one understands with being a giver. When you're a giver, people will take advantage of you, but you are never diminished because they did. They're diminished because they did. There's a big distinction. So people are saying, I'm afraid of giving or over delivering, or I'm afraid of sharing this because someone's going to steal it and take it. And then it's like, wrong. That's totally backwards. When you're a giver, people will take advantage of you. Expect it, get your head around it. But here's what happens. You will get that thing back that you gave from another event, another person, another circumstance, 100% of the time. So even in a podcasting kind of arena, to get your direct question, Alex, was my business mentor said, he says, there's this invisible scale in all of our lives. And on one side is all the things we're going to get. And on the other side is all the things we get to give and contribute. He said, this scale is never out of balance. It strives for balance all the time, no matter what. He said, so forget about what you're going to get. Forget about that part. Forget about the receiving. Do your best to get the scale out of balance by throwing everything on the other side and heaping it on the giving side as much as you can, and watch what happens. And I can share with you from consulting, even when I was doing business consulting, I was getting $1,500 an hour because I consistently over-delivered, and my clients knew that that's what was going to happen when they worked with me. And that's why I said no to more people than yes, because I was very selective. But when I did, I knew what I could do for them, and I over-delivered. And being a podcast guest, it means the same thing. Be willing to over-deliver. And part of that is also in the stories. You know, we're in United States of entertainment today. And, you know, and it really is a part of being able to tell that story. And I'm sure Michelle is a 10,000 times expert and has probably forgotten more about storytelling than I'll ever know. And I just have a, you know, tiny little acronym we can touch on later on that helps me tell stories. But that's really how it relates to. And I can share with you one thing as far as storytelling in the giver's mindset. I have found, for me personally, the story is partly how we present it, and pause and modulation and all those other things. 90% of it is the story that's in our mind, and how we can transfer that mindset or the story in our mind into the other person's mind, transferring that story. And there's methodologies to do that I can touch on later on as we go through our roundtable. But as a giver's mindset, be prepared to overgive. Be prepared to overgive to your hosts and all of the listeners. Over-deliver. Whatever the expectations are, go past them and watch how that comes back to you. You'll be astonished in very unexpected ways. But I can tell you this, 100% of the time, it does come back.
Love that, EA. That's really well said. You know, I want to jump over to Matthew real quick. I'm going to come back to Michelle in a minute here. But Matthew, I'm thinking about this whole idea of being a giver, right? Like having this giver's mindset. You're talking about how you give away the first chapter of your book. But how, is there anything you ever hold back? Like if a host is asking about chapter 8 or 9, I'm just using an example. Do you still go there, or do you try to hold some of that back? What are your kind of thoughts on what EA is sharing here? I'd love to kind of get a little dialogue going here.
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing is you should never hold back, because firstly, the guest can tell, and secondly, you frustrate the host. So for me, a lot of the times we all get asked to send our standard questions that we want asked. And when I first get on an interview with someone, I say, okay, so you've got your standard questions. Of course, we want to build that relationship. So when we get on to the podcast, it comes across as a lot more relational rather than I'm getting asked very structured questions. But one of the things I say is, look, mate, you know your audience better than I ever will. So I know that we've got structured questions, and I know, my whole brand's around being an introvert. I want you to not worry about me becoming unstuck. I mean, we're talking about my zone of genius, but you know how it relates to your audience. So if there's a question you want to ask, know that there's nothing out of bounds. Now for that, of course, you have to plan and prepare. It drives me nuts when, podcast guests go on and there's no structure, there's no strategy to what they do. Now, of course, the show can take a lots of different directions, and you need to be prepared for that. But the way I look at what I consider a successful podcast episode is, did I get the opportunity to tell a story? Now, number one thing for me in networking, in sales, in podcasting is it's not about me. It's about the guest. So I look at, for me, the host is trying to tailor to the guest. So if they ask me a question, I need to make it relevant to their audience. I need to make sure that I don't hold back. But in my world, as long as I tell one of my 3 core stories, and ideally my preferred, I say, everyone that goes on podcasts needs to have one story that they tell that just educates, inspires the audience to want to know more, but it allows them to also position themselves as the only logical choice. But it's not, I find people get on podcasts all the time, and it's like they open up this fire hose of jargon, and everybody's overwhelmed. That's why they skip to the next episode. So what I find is when somebody asks me a question, I will give a short answer or a longer answer if necessary, but then I'll segue into a story that fully elucidates exactly what I mean. And that then brings the audience in. Now, one of those stories is always one of my 3 main stories, which means I know that I've tried and tested it. It will, it'll educate, it'll motivate, it'll inspire, but it will help people go, oh my gosh, I want what Wendy has, or oh my gosh, I want what Alex has. I'm going to then find my way to work with Matt. Now, going back to the free book chapter, as long as I've given great value, as long as I've not held back, as long as I've told one of my stories and then possibly my origin story as well, so people can go, who's this really articulate guy saying he's not that he's an introvert? Help them realize that I actually am. I just come well planned. When I get to the end, there's a way to transition. See, what happens is if you don't hold back and you give great value, but then you start offering, when somebody says, where can people find out more about you? The number one mistake I see people make is, oh, you can go to my website, we've got all these great packages and we've got all these great services, and they're selling to people. That's crazy. It's also crazy to say, hey, buy my book, because in truth, if you've got 1,000 listeners that are listening to that podcast, maybe 50 will find their way to the Amazon page. Most of them will get distracted by shiny objects on the page, and maybe 5 will actually buy it, and then none of them will either read it, or one will, but you're going to be lucky if that person ever reaches out to you. So instead, when I get to the end, now I've given great value, somebody says, where can you find out more information about you? And I will respond with, well, obviously you can type in my name in Google. There's a whole bunch, you'll find a ton about me. Go to social, I share a whole bunch of videos there. But in truth, my publisher hates me when I say this, by the way. You do not need to buy my book. What you need to do, in my mind, is go to theintrovertsedge.com, and then I sell the free chapter. I'll say, there you're going to find the free chapter. It'll help you overcome your fear that you can sell as an introvert or you can network as an introvert. And then I'll outline the full 7-step process. And then I say, if you do nothing more than grab the 7 steps, put what you currently say in, you'll realize there's some things that don't fit. Throw that out. You shouldn't be saying it to clients. Then you'll realize there's some things out of order, and then you'll realize there's some gaping holes, usually around asking great questions and telling great stories. If you do nothing more than that, you'll double your sales in the next 60 days. And then I remind them of the URL again. And when I do that, what happens is you get all of these people then go and download the free chapter. The 200 that would have gone to Amazon now becomes 300 or 400 because it's free. Everyone loves free. They believe they're going to get the outcome out of the free content. And my first chapter does a ton. But then now I've got their email address. So I then send them reminders about buying the book and the bonuses that are involved. And I then share some more value about what's in the book. So a larger percentage of people then buy the book. Now, of course, I've still got their email address, right? So they then are reminded of the bonuses, they claim the bonuses. Now I know they've got the book. We then start giving them more value while talking about the products and services that we offer. So instead of luckily getting one, I get hundreds of email addresses off every podcast I go on. And then we can then market to them the book, the products, the services. It's a much greater way of creating ROI, but it also means I can go on a podcast and act totally disinterested about selling my products and services.
I love that. So I'm guessing you and EA agree on this for the most part, right? So it seems that way. Also, thanks for the great lineup of what a good call to action looks like at the end of an episode. I think that's fantastic what you just shared there. Michelle, I wanted to ask you a question. Matthew was just talking about how he has 3 stories that he always shares. Do you do something similar to that when you're thinking about going on a podcast? Do you have like a few things that are kind of packaged, ready to go, or a direction you generally take things in?
Kind of like they were both saying, I mean, there's some standard questions that we can put in front of them, but I actually prefer a more authentic conversation. I mean, yes, I have my core stories and I have, what I usually would talk about, but I usually go on a podcast and say, I have no agenda other than just sharing some great information to help your audience. You steer this where you want to go and I'll follow. And it just naturally, though, we can always tie in our core stories, because at the end of the day, if you're on a podcast or even if you're a host, people just want to know the backstory. What do you do? How did you get there? What was the pivotal moment that took you there? Because at the end of the day, anyone listening to a podcast, they're looking for either hope, most inspiration, motivation, or content that they can use immediately to implement. So I try not to make it cookie cutter and this is what I want to talk about and all that. But yes, it always still comes back to, my backstory and, typically the core stories that come out for me are, how I got started and me working with Zig Ziglar and what I do now to help people with stories. But I always try to tweak it. And again, I follow their lead in the direction that they want it to go.
I think that's really smart. I do have a personal question for you now. What was it like working with and for Zig Ziglar? Just out of curiosity. I think no one doesn't wonder that question, of course.
Yes, I'm so incredibly grateful for the opportunity. I worked for him right out of college, and I'm still many decades later very, very involved with the organization. Amazing. I mean, he truly, I've never met a man with more integrity in my life. We got to see him behind the scenes, behind closed doors, and I can honestly tell you he was better than anything you ever thought of him from a stage. He truly, truly was the most kind, gracious, loving Christian man you've ever met. And and that rubbed off on pretty much everybody, he talked to. And in fact, that's one thing I'll say, no matter who you were, no matter what you did for a living, when he spoke to you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world to him. And just and one thing I just have to add on to what EA and Matthew said was about the whole giving. I love that because, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, it's what Zig stood for, which is his famous quote, you can have everything in life you want if you just help enough other people get what they want. And that's what giving is, right? And giving without the intent of receiving anything is so powerful. So.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. I'm going to let EA jump in here in just a second. Real quick, I just want to mention that from the podcast host side of things, so me being mostly a podcast host, I do jump on some shows like Professor Pete's, who's in this room. I was on his last week. Something that I realized is that a lot of... yeah, I see ya. That a lot of podcast hosts will open up with the question, so tell the listeners about yourself. Now, the three of you that we have talking right now, you three are very qualified. You all know how to answer that question pretty well. Not everybody does, myself included, not having as much experience as the three of you on that side of the mic. When someone asks me that question, which is probably one of the most common questions people get asked, I don't know how to answer it in a way that it's a soundbite. And when I say soundbite, like try to keep that under a minute, because here's the thing. I've always realized, even me as a listener, because I listen to more podcasts than I record, than I'm on, I listen to them all the time. But when someone asks that question, I automatically just start to disconnect from it. Not to be rude, but because it's open-ended. That could go literally, tell us about yourself. I mean, that could be about your work, it could be about your day, it could be about anything. So I'm wondering, how do the three of you as guests, and I'm just going to, anyone who in here is a podcast host, be careful with that question. If you ask it to the wrong person, that could be a 20-minute tangent. So you want to find a different way to ask that. But the three of you, how do you kind of leverage that question to position a good podcast episode? Because I find the way you answer that sets the rest of the episode up for a win, or potentially just kind of like a giant rant, if you will. EA, I know you had something to share, so I'm going to let you go ahead and start off by answering that.
A couple of things. By the way, I totally mirror what Michelle was saying. I also had the opportunity to work with Zig in the 70s. He was with a company called Steed, and he was doing training, and it was actually an oil additive. And so I shared the stage with him a few times, and also another gentleman by the name of Cabot Roberts. I mean, I talk about old school. These are the masters, if you will, of the stage work. And everything Michelle said about Zig is exactly the way he was, right?
Small
exactly.
World. Look at that. Yeah, that's wild.
Extraordinary. And one of the things I want to say is that I'm probably a little more challenged as it relates to answering that first question than Matthew and Michelle is, because if I'm on a 1-hour podcast, that leaves, I need at least 55 minutes to just say my last name. And then it only leaves me 5 minutes to say the whole story, because that's why it says Givers University on screen, because my last name wouldn't fit across. Anyway, it's Csolkovits. So think Schwarzenegger, 15 consonants, 1 vowel. They look at it and go, you got to be kidding me. Anyway. So one of the things I found that were very helpful when getting that question, and if you want, Alex, I can touch a little bit about the acronym I use in storytelling, because it's actually sort of germane to that same thing if you'd like.
Yeah, as long as we just to be mindful of time, because everyone here will want to be respectful of that. But yeah, let's hear it. Yeah, just don't share your last name in this part, right?
Yeah, correct. And see, now Alex knew to say that, because I never say anything 10 minutes if I can say it in 20. So he knew that. Anyway, so the thing that happens with the first thing is I found personally one of the best ways to answer that is answer the question when I say tell you about yourself, is say it from an experience standpoint of how other people have impacted my life. So I always will go into right away how I met June Martino, who had the third most controlling stock at McDonald's. And she told me the whole story about everything, that was in the movie, The Founder with Ray Kroc, and how I met her. She's in the movie the whole time. So that was just weird the way that happened. And then also I talk about my mentor, and, so I use these experiences on how other people impacted me as a way for me to say, tell me a little bit about yourself. I share with them my experiences, and to share with a very simple acronym that I use in storytelling, which is, of course, hopefully what we want to zero in on here is, how do you tell a story? I use an acronym that is AVTNT. And AVTNT helps me have the mindset of how I can convey what's in my mind to the person who's listening to it. The A stands for amazed. In other words, in our minds, we have to be amazed that whatever the story is we're telling, that it actually happened. I'm totally amazed at some of the things that have happened in my life, and I'm still more amazed today than ever. So number one is inside our own mind, we have to be amazed at this story in order to properly convey that to other people. It's the V, because it's AVTNT, the V stands for vibration. That means we need to change our vibration based on the story we're telling. If I'm saying one about how one of my business partners betrayed me, I make sure that my rate of vibration gets adjusted. Like, can you believe that really happened? I just can't believe that happened. What are the odds of that happening? You know, I mean, so I change my rate of vibration so that it is directly parallel to the story that I'm telling. T, because it's AVTNT, the T is transference of feeling. How do you transfer the feeling in a few sentences that you're feeling in your mind and in your heart to the other person? Because that's what storytelling is all about, transferring of information to them. I've seen people give great stories and do it in such a way that I'm just like, I'm already nodding off as they're starting to talk. And I've watched people tell stories that were like sort of not really information packed, and yet they held my interest and were on the back of my seat because of how they told the story and how they pictured it in their mind. So T is transference of feelings. N is as though it was happening now. Now, this is a little bit of a challenge because, you know, I mean, when I was doing 1 to 3 interviews a day, I have to tell you, sometimes I went like, wait, did I just tell that story? Or did I say that on a previous interview? And in my own mind, I start getting, wait, if I tell the whole story again, they're going to think this guy's a whack job. He's, you know, he just told us that story and he just said it again. So in our mind, we have to live in the now when we're telling the story, and the story you're conveying, convey it like it's happening to you right then, like you're a court reporter in your own mind. So we have AVTN, and then the last T is tell the story like you were sitting across from a really good friend, sitting at a coffee shop, having a cup of coffee, and just share it with them, including all of the tiny details that you would say in those kinds of environment to a friend that you may not say with anyone else, because we tend to oversimplify stories. And when we do that, we diminish the impact on the other person by leaving out the details that we would normally share with a friend. Like, can you believe that happened? What was ever going through their mind? You know, the little tiny little questions and details to it. So I use as an acronym myself anyway, you know, and this is probably very elemental compared to what Michelle would teach, but it's AVTNT is what I use as an acronym to constantly remind myself. Proper storytelling is being able to get the story from my mind and to make sure I'm seeing it, feeling it, and sensing it in my mind first, and then to convey that into their minds as a direct result of how I portray that information to them.
So AVTNT, amazed vibration, transference of feeling as though it's happening now, and telling a story as if you're telling it to a friend. I think that's really great. And actually, I want to jump over to Matthew because I still want Matthew to answer that question. How do you respond to the question? So tell us about yourself, but also what we just shared here with storytelling. That sounds like a lot for an introvert, and there's a lot of introverts on the host side of a mic and on the guest side. And you don't look like an introvert, and I'm sure you get that all the time, but I probably just don't have a great understanding of it. So anyway, I'd love for you first off to answer the question, how do you answer the question? Tell us about yourself, and then how does what EA just said kind of relate to you as an introvert?
Sure. So firstly, you know, yeah, absolutely, because introverts are all supposed to be hiding under a bridge, hoping never to be seen, right? That's how all introverts are.
That's what I've heard.
I think people have this wrong perception. I think anytime we see somebody that's successful on stage in podcasts, somebody that's articulate, everyone goes, oh, it's easy for them. They're naturally, extroverted. They've got that gift of gab. By the way, just because we're all talking about Zig Ziglar was an introvert. You know, I interviewed Tom Ziglar on my podcast, The Introvert's Edge, and Tom talked about stories of his dad. Like, how can we believe that introverts can't be articulate and can't be naturally out there when Zig Ziglar, the most well-known sales trainer on the planet, really happened to be an introvert? By the way, Ivan Meisner, the founder of BNI, happens to be an introvert. Oh, Oprah Winfrey, Ellen DeGeneres, 2 talk show hosts because we can't do small talk, right? But yet there they are, and they're both introverts. So we've got to start to really change our perception of what introversion actually is. Introversion only means we draw our energy from being by ourselves, not with people. So if you charge up by being with people, you're an extrovert. If you charge up, like for instance, after this show, I'm going to have a little bit of downtime. Why? Because while I love doing this, like a kid at Disneyland, once I'm off the ride, I'm a little tired, right? So let's now talk about the concept of how to actually answer that question. So firstly, I mean, this is happening more and more, right? People are starting to do everyday podcasts. They fit it into their day jobs. So because of that, they're doing less and less research and hoping that it comes out in the show. So because of that, now if somebody asks you, what would you like me to say? I'll give them 1 or 2 points because I know they've come unprepared. I give them 1 or 2 points and I give them credibility points that they can leverage. I'll say something like, call me the rapid growth guy. Tell people I'm, the author of the Introvert's Edge series, or mention that that I've been responsible for 5 multi-million-dollar success stories, something like that. You choose. But if they're going to ask me to introduce myself, there is no way I'm going to lead with credibility, because especially for the introverts in the audience, you're going to switch them off straight away. Oh, this guy's just a self-promoter. The next thing you do not want to do is either, well, you don't want to give your awards away, but you also do not want to give your resume away. You're going to bore them to death. Like I see technologists go on, they go, I got a degree from here, I've met this person, I've done these things, and it's like, oh, like just get into remembering it's not about you, it's about the audience and the difference that you're going to make on their personal lives. So for me, I'll get up and I'll say, people know me as the rapid growth guy. I've written the Introvert's Edge series, but what I'm truly passionate about is helping introverts realize they're not second-class citizens. I go straight into that, and then I tell people the mission I'm on, which helps people realize the niche I'm here to serve. So as soon as I do that, everybody sits up in their seats that I care to help and go, oh, this episode's for me. Everyone else can switch off for all I care. In truth, they won't, because as soon as that happens, the host will say, oh, but talking about before, this applies to extroverts as well, because you guys need systems, because I've done my homework before. I even pressed record and I explained how it adds value to everyone else as well. But I want the host to do the sales job, not me. So making sure that I help the audience realize why this is about them and why it's going to make a difference in their life is what I care about when I'm introducing myself. Now, for all those people like, well, hang on a second, what if you never get to talk about yourself? Well, the truth is that somebody is going to ask a question at some point during that interview. Where did you come up with that idea? Or where did you discover that? And then I can talk about my origin story, which can then lead me in to the resume. But in truth, I then get to talk about my acne, my reading speed issues, the fact that I was the kid that was shy with the funny colored lenses that felt like the slow kid, like it is right now, which means that I get to bring myself down a peg and win the audience over before I then deliver the resume of things that could be seen as egocentric otherwise. Okay, so let's talk about story, which I think was the third part of your question. So for me, I speak on the power of story all the time, because in each one of my books, both in networking and sales, and if I wrote a book on podcasting or speaking from stage, I would say the same thing. Story is the heart of any sale and the heart of any networking process, because stories, there's 3 scientific facts that you just can't get past. First is it activates the reticular activating system of our brain, which means when I tell you a story, all of a sudden your brain and my brain start to synchronize, which creates artificial rapport, which I can then turn into real rapport. So that's really powerful. The second thing is people remember up to 22 times more information when embedded into a story. Powerful for 2 reasons for introverts. Firstly, it's going to stop me, it's going to allow me to leave my fire hose of information at home and only tell elements that are relevant to the specific story that I'm talking about. So I'm not going to overwhelm someone. But secondly, people most of the times won't remember much of your interview, but they'll remember Wendy, they'll remember the key elements. Like if I was to mention chairs, porridge, and beds right now and said to everyone, remember that for a year and I'll come back next year and ask you the question, no one's going to remember. But if I said Goldilocks and the 3 bears, all of a sudden, chairs, porridge, and beds are going to come straight to your head. And the third, and this is the most critical, is it short circuits the logical brain. You speak directly to the emotional brain, which means when you're answering a logical question, the brain's like, that'll work for me, that won't work for me. I'm not sure if I've got time for this next episode. When you start telling a story, the logical brain literally short circuits and the brain goes, story time. And the emotional brain literally just listens. I've had cold callers that can't keep people on the phone for 8 seconds before a C-level exec will hang up. You get 2.5 minutes before the C-level executive's logical mind ticks back on. So it gives you a huge power in podcast because you can tell a 5-minute story and still have someone totally engaged. Now, the reason why stories are great for introverts is that introverts can write those stories down, remember them, perfect them, so that when they get on and they're asked a question, of course, you want to answer questions, but when that opportunity to tell that story comes up, instead of getting stuck in their head, they can deliver it in a really professional way. Now, I know we all don't want to sound scripted, but remember, every actor you've ever seen on TV is reading from a script. With great practice, allows you to portray it in a much better way. And then the other thing that I will say is it allows you to present the best version of yourself, the really well-rehearsed version, and do it in a really authentic way because it's your story.
That's great, man. Something you said at the beginning there, I want to touch on two things. First off, you talked about how it's not about you, it's about the audience. So when someone asks the question, tell us about yourself, you just kind of say a few things, very short, and then you throw it back to being about the audience. I think that's really gold. That was kind of a key takeaway for me. And also, to your point here, that stories are remembered so much longer. That was one of your points there. I can't remember my pastor's 3 points he said on Sunday, and I'm sorry to admit that, everybody. But 2 years ago, he told a story about how his childhood home burnt down. And thankfully, they all got out and stuff like that. But I remember that story, and that was 2 years ago. But just on Sunday, he had 3 really good points that I can't recall right now. So what you're talking about is really a great way to convey information if you can find a way to put it in story form. So Michelle, I want to cut over to you with that because I know you've got a lot of experience with storytelling. First off, back to that main question, how do you go about answering the question, tell us about yourself? And then let's talk a little bit about story from your perspective.
Absolutely. So I do try to coach, when I'm hosting, I do try to give a little bit of coaching on that because sometimes you're right. People don't know where to start. And it's like, oh my gosh, what's my story? It's, when somebody asks what your story is, the backstory, it's for the purpose of, again, the audience. I mean, that at the end of the day, you are on a podcast to provide value in a very probably specific area because it's usually, the theme of the podcast or something like that. But I say this, so I'm a publisher. I help people to tell their stories through books. So I'm going to give the same advice I give to all of our authors. Do not speak too much. I mean, meaning like keep it short and sweet. Sound bites are key. I mean, it is media, even though the platform may allow us to just go on and on and on. The reality is human brains, they're going to shut off after about a minute or two of just talking. I mean, if there is no stopping, you are literally going to lose people's attention. So when you say something short to the point for the benefit of here's what, what the listener is going to get out of this, then allow the host to ask questions because at the end of the day, it is a podcast and their job, a good host is going to ask questions and try to pull it out of you. If you just give enough to where they're intrigued, they're going to ask more questions and they're going to dig deeper. If you give it all and then they're like, okay, no more questions. I mean, that's usually not a good thing. So short and sweet is really, in my opinion, the best way to go. And especially at the beginning of a podcast, because that host has an agenda. They're asking you, but they're not expecting you to ramble on, in my opinion. So short and sweet is really key there. And then, and then you were, what was the second question? Sorry, Alex. Well,
actually I have a follow-up to that real quick that I want to add, because as a host, I just had this happen last week. I had somebody on my podcast who was not really experienced on podcasts, and that was fine because we had a really good interview. I read his book beforehand. I knew what I wanted to ask him. But something that I always do is I get a soundbite, as many podcast hosts do, which is just like a download of usually 1 minute so you can post on social media. That's what Instagram allows. Most of those places will allow. But with his episode, I had my team go through it, and he didn't at all. And I'm not trying to talk bad about him, but he did not share a 1 minute segment that actually made sense. We needed about 2 minutes on all of them. So we ended up just not doing one. Now, I have these really experienced guests that come on, and they'll share stuff that's like 58 seconds, but it's like they knew I was going to take that as a soundbite. It was almost that good. Like they've actually practiced that. And so I just had Mike Michalowicz on the podcast, and he did a 58-second thing that was like on point, and I swear he probably does it on every podcast he goes on or in that way. And so that's kind of speak to the power of like a soundbite. Your podcast host will use that if you give them the opportunity to share something that's really powerful and really short. And I want to direct this question a little bit different to you, Michelle, because I want you to just talk about like kind of some storytelling techniques, but you've been on both sides of the mic. You're about to reset your podcast. I guess, is that this week or is that next week?
Probably in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, next couple of weeks. All right. So you've been on both sides of the mic. How do you find that hosts can help guests tell their story well? Like, what are some techniques as a host for me? How can I make sure that I'm getting that story out? Because what if I accidentally ask a question that just there's no way they can continue the story anymore? Like, what is your advice to a host?
Well, so I like to coach a little bit because not everybody knows how to be a guest on a podcast, even if they've done it 100 times. So just little bits of like what we're doing here. Here's some things that I found to help be more successful. Everything from, your lighting to your audio quality, the basics to, hey, these are some of the questions I'm probably going to ask you. But the purpose of it is I want my listeners, to people that are listening in, are business owners, entrepreneurs, founders, leaders, and they're looking for something to get more results in their business, but they really want to hear it from people who have, they're coming from the heart of wanting to make a difference. So it's a very specific thing. And so I'll tell them those things up front so that they can prepare. But what I usually try to do, it's sometimes hard and sometimes people just will keep talking, but if they know what to expect up front, and then you can also, there's ways to jump in, to not interrupt, like, okay, we're done with this, but there's ways that you can kind of feed into what they're saying, but then redirect it. Like, so if you're talking, I so relate to that. And you know what, that brings up another point. Let me ask you this. And then it kind of will just, take them down a different path. But as much as you can do up front to prep, I do videos to our guests, just, hey, here are some things that I think work, and whatever we can do in advance just to help. But also just to kind of relieve their nerves. Like this shouldn't be stressful. This is just two friends. Maybe we don't know each other yet, but we will be friends at the end. And we're just having a conversation. I think AE said it, pretend like you're at coffee with a friend, and you wouldn't be all, buffed up and talk forever and ever and ever to a friend, or you wouldn't have any friends, right? So you just be you, and it's a conversation is give and take. So
I couldn't agree anymore with that. Actually, the first time I ever got on the guest as a podcast, I'm an outgoing guy, I'm animated. The first time I got on a podcast as a guest, I froze up. So I went straight from like, yeah, this is gonna be super fun, to recording like, hey, happy to be here. I just completely shifted out of like my nerves of not knowing what to do there. And he was a really experienced host, thankfully, and it wasn't live. He's like, oh, dude, we're just keep on, like, just because it's recording doesn't mean to be any different. I was like, oh, thank you, kind of like relieve that. And now I do my best to do that with my guests as well. I just tell them like, hey, we're just gonna record, and if we need to cut some of it out, we can cut it out. Let's just have fun and talk and just see where it goes. And I think that's a really important point, right?
I completely, and if I could just add to that, I think that's why podcasting is so popular and why so many people are going to podcasts, because it is more authentic. If people really wanted the formal process, then they watch something on TV, or, go watch a video to download or something, but people want to be that, fly on the wall in a conversation with two passionate people, right? Or two professional business owners, or two, name whatever the theme of the podcast is. So I think that's what makes it so, why we want to listen to podcasts. We just want to hear real stories of real people, not trying to be polished and their best.
I couldn't agree anymore.
But still professional.
Still professional, but yeah, I could not agree more. That's so powerful. So I want to leave time after we're done recording in a minute here for the audience to ask questions, but we're going to stop the recording before we do that. So right before we stop recording, though, I'd love to hear a final thought from each of you, so we have it on the recorded side of things. So just something real brief. EA, we'll jump back over to you, then we'll go to Matthew, then Michelle, and then we'll shut off the recording and we'll go to some Q&A stuff. But EA, go ahead and take us away with your final thought.
My final thought was having to do with, on the other side of the microphone, I was very blessed to do interview 1,000 millionaires, over 1,000 millionaires in 2 years. And as a result of that, when I had the business talk show, I actually genuinely wanted to learn from every one of these people, because I wanted to find the common threads because I knew that they had to be a millionaire to be on the show. So they knew and could sense, even when I started the questions before the interview, that I genuinely was interested in what they did. And I had my questions in place, and their comfort level went right through the roof, because they knew this wasn't going to be an automated kind of thing. I really genuinely wanted to learn. And that was one of my favorite phrases. Could you teach me about that? I'd love to learn about that. And that had a huge impact. So from a host standpoint and from the listener standpoint and telling stories, I think, the genuineness of really, really wanting to learn something from the event is a really powerful tool.
Yeah, so I would say, and very much going to Michelle's point here about, The coaching sometimes is required, but I think both host and guest have responsibility. I mean, when I look at a show and I see some episodes that are 20 minutes and some that are an hour, sometimes I would say, gosh, if I'm interviewed for an hour, they're going to think I did a great job. No, those people often just were long-winded in their answers. But the short 20-minute ones, I could easily assume those people were cut off or they weren't providing great content. So I'll always say, leading in, obviously you've got episodes that are 20 to 60 minutes. What's your optimum length for what you find your guests prefer? And then if they say 30 minutes, I now know I've got a 30-minute interview. That's what I'm aiming for. But then if the host asks me a question like, hey Matt, can you do me a favor? Can you tell me the 7 steps that you need for a sale and give us a little bit of detail on each one of those? Gosh, even if I did that in 2 minutes each, that's half the episode. And I remember still to my second interview, I was asked that question and I answered him. And at the end, it was like, well, that's all the time we've got for today. And so you really have to take a moment to go, okay, they just asked me what 7 questions are. I don't want to hold back, but he shouldn't have asked me that because he's only got a 20-minute interview. So how can I answer this where I'm not feeling like I'm not giving everything till it hurts, but also make sure that I'm mindful of this is a dialogue we're trying to have. And you can answer it by saying, well, the 7 steps, I'd love to give you all that. You can read all about that in the first chapter of my book. I don't mean to say that, but you can just download it for free at this link. The one thing that I find most people struggle with for the interview and the time we have together today, let's really focus in on that. And then I go out of my way to explain it. So I think from a lot of people from a guest perspective, you've got to remember, you've got to take charge. And as a host, you've got to remember to ask questions that are on point that don't. I mean, if you ask, tell me a little bit about yourself, that could be a 1-minute answer or a 40-minute answer. Same deal. If you ask a question about their ideology, if you don't know enough, you don't know how big a can of worms you're opening. But if you say, we're only looking for a couple of minute answers, so if I ask a question that's a little bit overboard, feel free to truncate the question when you answer it, then all of a sudden you're back in control. So I think that from a podcast host or a podcast guest perspective, it's really about being strategic. It's really about analyzing the length and how long every question is. And if you want to put a 5-minute answer with a story in, you've got to remember you're going to have to truncate a lot of the other answers to still hit that 30-minute milestone. So if you go in with a strategic approach rather than, I'm just going to answer every question to the fullest that's going to end up an hour interview, then you're going to get a much better success with the host. And that then at the end, when you say, hey, I'd love to get some introductions to some new people, would you like some introductions to guests? They're going to be much more likely to go, yeah, absolutely, because you were an amazing interview. Like I'm sure, Alex, you'll do for Mike Michalowicz, as often as you can, because he provides great value to every guest, to every host that interviews him.
So I'll jump in. So the thing I think about with podcasts, I think more than ever, this is one of the best platforms to really build a platform beyond, it's not just about podcasting. It's not about a book. It's not about speaking. At the end of the day, it's about your story. It's connecting with other people. But what a podcast is really, truly a win-win. When it's a great episode, it's a win-win because the guest and the host both have an agenda, if you will. The host, their goal is to continue to build their platform and be that trusted authority, and that they're bringing in great guests with great content that is really bringing value to their audience. But the guest is also, they're getting on a podcast because they're hoping to increase their authority, increase their brand, build that platform too. So as a host, whatever you can do to put that spotlight on them, make it about them, make it about, putting them in the best spot. Yes, as a host, of course, it may be our show, but really it's not about us. So we have to make it about them and literally just turn that spotlight to them. And they will be so appreciative of that. The host will be appreciative because that was a great show and you brought out the best in that person. And then the listener is going to be thrilled because now they know, they connect with that person. And here's the thing, we can't do business with everyone, but we do want to do business with people that are our prime clients, right? How do we make that easy on our clients to figure out if we're a good fit for them? They want to work with those they know, like, and trust. So on the show, as a guest or as a host, just be you. Don't try to be anything more because you won't connect with everyone. But if you're authentic, you will connect with the ones that you are supposed to move forward with and maybe do business with. And that's really what building a platform is all about.
Love it. Love the final thoughts from all three of you. Michelle, Matthew, EA, thank you so much for being here. We're going to go to Q&A with everybody now. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So thanks for listening, everybody.